Hi everybody. For this week's module, I was assigned Johnston-Chapter 1. So Chapter 1 of Johnston begins with the story of Robert. Robert is an individual who is part of a day program where he refuses to attend any activities. Robert becomes a distraction by pestering the other residents. There are multiple professionals who are a part of Robert's team that meet together to discuss Robert's behavior. Zoe is a BCBA who serves with individuals with disabilities. Liz is a psychologist, and Sharon is a social worker. Them, along with other professionals, come together to collaborate on what to do with Robert's behavior during his daytime program. The three main debaters during Robert's meeting are Liz, Sharon, and Zoe. Liz and Sharon quickly decide that Robert chooses not to participate in the activities that do not interest him. Zoe is the one who does not only acknowledge that Robert should not be forced to participate if he does not want to, however, she also wonders about the reasons for Robert's lack of interest. These two entirely different standpoints are the main topic of Chapter 1. Liz and Sharon take on the free will side, while Zoe is more of a determinism side. Zoe brought up taking into consideration the reinforcers of Robert's behavior. However, Liz and Sharon were slightly closed off to taking into consideration Zoe's idea. Zoe realized that it would be more difficult to debate the free will versus determinism debate with the other professionals, so she switches her focus to the consequences of Robert's actions. When digging deeper within the free will versus determinism debate, we see an inside versus outside debate. Liz and Sharon certainly take on the inside standpoint, meaning they believe Robert's uncooperative behavior is entirely his choice and has no outside influences. Zoe wants to bring up the outside approach. The outside perspective means that there are external influences, such as our environment or hereditary factors, that determine our behavior. Liz and Sharon, as people who believe in free will, may use language such as, Robert chooses, or I decided to eat a salad instead of a potato. The word chooses and decided portray a decision that was internal rather than influenced by external factors. After reading Robert's story, I was asking myself, what exactly is free will? Free will is a philosophical position where the assumption is made that our choices are made entirely without outside influences. Prior to reading this chapter, I would have naively and partially agreed with Sharon and Liz. I would have believed that I choose to do certain tasks solely based on my own internal processes. On page 4, I found it incredibly interesting learning about the everyday language we use that implies our daily choices are made without any external factors. Language such as, I made up my mind, or I made myself wash the dishes, or even I decided to do this, are all illusions when considering the side of determinism. So, my next question was, what exactly is determinism? Determinism states that our behavior is determined by external forces. Determinism is the counterpoint to free will. Something that determinism lacks, that free will does not, is a sense of autonomy. This may help explain why, at the beginning of the chapter, Liz and Sharon felt threatened to the idea of reinforcers being involved in Robert's behavior. Determinism lacks the autonomy in a sense that there are external factors that cause our behavior. This means our internal decisions do not matter. Behavior must be measured in some way. Therefore, it makes sense to believe that physical behavior must be explained by physical events. On page 4, the sentence that struck me the most was, if your job is to explain how the physical universe works, it makes little sense to try to explain something happens for no reason at all. Both assumptions of free will and determinism are nearly impossible to prove. However, Johnston does begin to explain the different variations of free will and determinism, which thus explains the more rational and observable side of practical use of determinism. It is impossible to determine a cause if there could be no cause according to free will. However, with determinism, there would be numerous and a variety of different causes that also make it impossible to officially determine the direct cause. People like answers. Scientists especially like answers when studying behavior, because they avoid open-endedness. We learn on page 8 that scientists are parsimonious when trying to understand behavior to avoid measuring behavior that is not physically explained. Without a physical dimension, behaviors cannot be explained in a physical universe. The issue with behavior under determinism that I found most interesting was when Johnson was explaining responsibility. He brought up the exact question that I was wondering prior to reading the entire chapter. Are we responsible for our behaviors if there are all these potential external forces? Johnson goes into explaining the consequences that come after our behavior. It makes sense to believe that we behave in parallel with the consequences that come after our behavior. No matter the behavior, we do deal with its consequences. Rules and laws are in place to influence behaviors. Based on the consequences of those rules and laws, our behavior is determined. But what about choice? While choice and decisions are not scientifically credible when explaining behavior, the language we use for our behavior is taught to us at an incredibly young age. Johnson uses an example of eliminating the language of choice and replacing it with a description. While it was difficult at first, it makes me realize I choose the things that I do. For example, I choose to read a book. By eliminating I choose, I can say I am reading this book because it is my favorite book and it's by my favorite author. I like all of her previous novels. On page 15, Johnson really knocks it home for me. Under the section, Consequences for Practitioners, he explains the difficulty that ABA practitioners have when trying to explain how their environmental factors may influence positive and negative behaviors. This was Johnson's way of returning back to Robert's story and the difficulty that Zoe was having when talking to other professionals. If agreeing with Liz and Sharon, Robert's behavior cannot be changed if he had nothing but free will. Professionals like Zoe may begin focusing on the choices Robert may have and how to influence his choices and behaviors. For example, teaching Robert more appropriate courses of action and rewarding Robert for making less disruptive choices can alter the way he behaves and hopefully eliminates all his problem behaviors at the day program in the future. As a registered behavior technician, I realize that I do this every day. This makes it hard for me to understand how I believed we had free will prior to reading this chapter. Johnson closes his chapter by stating that if people are still struggling to let go of the free will debate after reading this chapter, they will still continue to struggle with the rest of the book. He closes a question, where do you stand? After learning about the hereditary and environmental causes under determinism, and especially after changing my language to eliminate language of free will, I can now say that I completely side with Zoe. Our job as professionals on an individual like Robert's team, it would be my job to create an intervention plan for Robert and not just assume there is nothing that I can do to change or influence Robert for better behavior. In this chapter, the turning point for me was when Johnson talked about the language that gives us a sense of autonomy and choice. Originally, I would have believed that I am reading a book just because that is what I choose to do at that moment. Then Johnson states the obvious external, environmental, and hereditary forces that make me ask myself, why this book? I want to read this book because it was written by my favorite author and I enjoyed her previous books. My decision was influenced. My question for discussion is, what was your standpoint at the beginning of this chapter? Were you more towards free will or determinism? Did it change after this chapter? If so, what was your turning point?